I think the additional students who arrive, Evan, will probably already know you. But we do come from a number of different departments, particularly at UIC. This is Professor Evan McKenzie, and he has been doing for decades now important work on what might be called just privatization, and he's going to be doing some new work on returning privatization projects to municipal government or general government. His most famous early book was Privatopia. The book you read is Beyond Privatopia, and his new book is Private Metropolis. Evan is head of the political science department and quite knowledgeable about all the fields of political science. But Evan, I'll turn it over to you and let you give your presentation, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions as we go.
Thank you, Dick. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to see this huge group of students so interested in urban politics. It's really wonderful. And so, Dick, thank you for putting all this together and all the good work you did in getting this organized. It's really wonderful. I guess what I'm going to do here is share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation here for you, but I don't want to, if possible, I would like to not get locked into sort of doing all the talking. So I'm going to keep, if you have comments or questions, observations along the way, please let's stop and take them if you don't mind. I'd like to do it that way rather than just be sort of monologuing, but I'll give this a shot. Let me see, I'll share the screen. I'll sort of jump into this. All right, here we go. Let's see how it goes. There we are. I hope everyone can see that pretty well. And I hope you can hear me reasonably well. So what I'm going to be talking with you about today is something that goes under a number of different names: residential community associations, homeowner associations, condominiums, many different, the nomenclature is pretty complex, but we're speaking of residential private governments that have become very prevalent across the country over the last 30, 40 years. And I look at them as an aspect of privatization, and I will try to put them in that theoretical framework. And I'll show you the main topics in just a second. So these are the books that Dick was talking about, 3 books that deal generally or specifically with this topic. And I've written a lot of other articles and whatnot on it. And what we're working on now, Alba Alexander and Larry Bennett and Mike Pagano and I are working on is the reversal of privatization schemes in the US and around the world. We're going to have a Zoom conference on that on December 10th. And then we're hoping to generate another edited volume out of that. So there's kind of a cycle. Now, so the main topics that I wanted to address with you first are, what is common interest housing? Some of you may know, others may have no idea. So I thought we'd, all get up to speed at the same level on that. Why has it become so prevalent? Why is it significant? And then talk about it as a form of privatization without accountability, without the normal measures that are built into privatization plans to make sure that they work. I would then talk with you a bit about the fragility of residential private government as an institutional sector, which I think is very important because local governments and state governments have basically disclaimed any responsibility for what goes on in these associations, and it has massive public consequences. So I think that was a huge mistake and something that is going to have to be reversed. If we have time, I'll give you a case study from Illinois that kind of shows you the way courts have tended to view these associations. It's the case of Porus versus Lake Holiday Property Owners Association. I think you might find that interesting. And then a variety of other issues, sort of issues about taxing and spending, if we have time to get to that. So that's the overview. First, like, what is it? What I'm speaking of here are what we would look at if we see them on the street is condominiums and single family homes that are in subdivisions with homeowners associations. So we see in Chicago lots of condo buildings, And in the suburbs, often you see a lot of the housing is in these subdivisions that have homeowners associations. There also are housing cooperatives. There's a few hundred in Chicago, but they're really kind of different. I'll mention them, but they're set up differently. And many of these things I might have to say about that, maybe not 100% true of co-ops. But the essential characteristics are a special form of ownership, a divided ownership, where as a property owner, you don't just own everything in what we call fee simple. You have an individual interest, and you also have a common interest. So you have something that you own just yourself as the property owner, and you have something else that you share ownership with the other owners. And that is where a lot of the problems come from. Collective action problems and other issues arise from the common interest part of this ownership. And then there's private land use controls, that is private lawmaking, sometimes called CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions, sometimes called equitable servitudes and other terms. But basically, it's private lawmaking. It is regulating people's behavior in their homes, around their homes, and with their property through private means that are, of course, enforced in the public, in the governmental courts, enforceable, but these are private controls over the use of land and over our behavior. And then there's a private government, normally in the form of a not-for-profit corporation, condo association, HOA. The things that they do are things that local government has traditionally done: collecting and spending revenue, basically the equivalent of taxing and spending, budgeting, and providing services and amenities that are, comparable to those that are provided by state and local governments. And also a planned living environment, usually. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean a gated community, but it means somebody was thinking, what kind of people are going to live here? How are they going to live? How old will it be? Will it be children? Will it be young adults? Will it be seniors? Will they have boats? Will they have, how many cars will they have? Will they will they need a bike path? So there's planning and thought that goes into it, which I would argue frequently leads to sort of an increase in segregation, in urban segregation. And there's some evidence to support the fact that that's going on. I did one paper about income segregation on this, using, analyzing basically a lit review of the data on this. And it's clear that this type of housing seems to be promoting segregation by income, because these developments are priced in very narrow price bands. So they tend to segregate people by income, and arguably by other things as well, other measures as well. Now, in essence, I have been saying since, I guess, the mid 80s, which is, kind of dates me terribly, but there you go, that this is the largest scale privatization of local government functions that has ever taken place. I mean, we talk about big ones like the parking meters, the Skyway, water systems. Yeah, those are big. Those are big. But I'm going to show you the scale of this level of privatization in a minute. And I think you'll agree with me, this is the biggest privatization of local government functions ever. But the thing is, unlike normal privatization plans, it wasn't really planned. It was basically just carried out with no provisions for accountability. And I will talk with you in just a bit about what I mean by accountability and why I think that's very significant for people interested in local government. So, quick overview. I teach a course on this in the law school, UIC Law School. I will not go into that kind of detail with you. I'll spare you the agony of going through all that. But a little bit of legal terminology here. First, there's a difference between HOAs, condos, and cooperatives in the nature of the ownership. So, and it is significant, because if you buy a home in a homeowner association, usually in the suburbs, not necessarily, but you actually own a detached house with your own yard. You have a little piece of the earth, you have a house stuck to it, just traditional land ownership. That's why you could really create HOAs, for any time in the last 500 or 600 years, because it's just all done with common law deed restrictions. You have a house, it sits on the ground, you can work that out. The common interest, the common areas, the streets, the rec areas, the meetings, the halls, the ponds, the lakes, all that is owned by the homeowners association. So it's nice and neat. You own the house and the yard, the association, and of course you have a voting interest to control the association in which you're a member, but they own the common elements. Now, a condominium is a weird creature of statute, not common law, meaning until enabling acts were passed in the US in the early 60s, there was no such thing as a condominium. They did not exist. And the reason is because you don't own a piece of the earth. Your house does not sit on a piece of the earth. So how, in what sense is that actually real estate? See? I mean, if you can own it as personal property, you can own a piece of a car or anything else that floats around on the earth that isn't attached to the earth as personal property. But to be real property, it's supposed to be attached to the land. And of course, a condo, might be floating in space 200 feet up. So the way this works is the individual interest in a condo is just an airspace. It is literally just the air within the units, the airspace, and the inner finished surface of the walls and floors. So what do you own? You own the airspace, and you own the paint and the carpeting, and that's it. That's what you own. That's your individual interest. It's basically a legal fiction. You want to pound a nail in the wall? Well, that building, the whole building, except for the airspaces, is owned in common by the owners. The association doesn't own it. The owners own it. Each one has a percentage interest in it. So what that means in practice is you can't drive a nail into that wall unless the association says it's all right, because that's partly you, but it's also all the other owners. Co-ops are different. There's different ways to do it, but basically you own a share of stock in a corporation. The corporation owns the building and they lease your unit to you. So you are your own landlord. It's like a business co-op where the employees own the building, like Woodman's, or I think True Value or Ace Hardware. One of them is a co-op. Land of Lakes Butter is a co-op. The workers own the business. In a co-op, the tenants own the building. They are their own landlord.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Was there a question or comment? Okay.
Okay, did you request and get a
Alicia,
confirmation?
you need to mute yourself. We'll do
Well, in the confirmation,
Oh, I see.
so
Someone's
do you
got to
need a
mute their
one-day
mic.
code?
Yep, 1 second.
Okay. Well,
You may have to unmute yourself again now, Evan, but we won't have the interruption.
All
There you
right.
go.
Okay. We live again? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
Okay, good. So common interest housing, this way of doing things has become the predominant form of new housing construction across the United States and in fact around the world, in many countries around the world. It's probably 250 million people living in private communities in China, for example. I could go on and on. I mean, Australia, New Zealand, the Middle East, Europe, many parts of Europe. So Russia, etc. And there's reasons for that, which I'll get to. But what this means is that housing choice is very restricted, and in many parts of the country, you really people are forced into it. So the idea that people have chosen it voluntarily is being undermined by the fact that it's spread so rapidly. Why is my screen not advancing? There we are. Okay. I'll give you some numbers and then show you a graph. It's about 20% of the housing units in the country, and over 20% of the population. Looks like I've got a typo there, but probably over 60% of the units are in HOAs, over a third in condos, and a small number in housing co-ops. Let me show you this as a graph. You'll see how fast this grew. 1960, there were fewer than 500 in the entire country. Now, well, as you can see, we're upwards of we're 350,000 or more. And it has shot up. And if you look at where that begins to take off, it's right at the beginning of what we always call the neoliberal era, the era of people demanding property tax cuts, of the era of where privatization was the coolest way of doing anything, undermining trust in government. This institution really, to me, just epitomizes the neoliberal era for a whole variety of reasons, just replacing governments with private corporations. Here's some census data from the 2015 Census of Governments. If you look, or I'm sorry, Census of Housing. If you look here, this I highlighted in red that new single family housing sold in each of these years across, this is the whole country, over 70% in HOAs. So that 22% is going to be going up and up and up every year, as it has been for decades. It's just going to keep going up. And this is the number per state. Highest number would be California, Florida, Texas, and right there is Illinois. With, millions of people in each of these states. I mean, there's, 20 states that have over at least 1 million people in them living in these condos and HOAs. Now, when I say that this institution really matters, I mean, initially when I started writing about this in the 80s, many people thought, well, this isn't that big a deal. Okay, but now 22% of the population, an estimated $9 trillion in property values that is in the hands of untrained, unsupported amateur board directors who are just, maybe they work in an insurance company during the day or whatever, and then they come in at night, they try to manage an association and make big decisions. And I'll show you, if we have time, how wrong that can go. But this is the idea, that just untrained elected members of the association or ordinary owners can just manage all this and make all these decisions without the benefit of any of the institutional support that local governments have when they make decisions like that. They're collecting over $100 billion a year from people, over $100 billion a year in private taxation. They probably have over 25 billion on reserve. That is for major building repairs. And as I expect to explain, that is nowhere near enough. There isn't anyone in the business who thinks that they have anywhere near enough to cover the eventual needs of repair and replacement of major building components, which is a significant issue that we face, as evidenced by what happened in Florida in June. Why is this happening? I think this would probably interest you because I studied this. I did a quantitative study of the state of California many years ago to try to understand, why is this taking off? And I studied all the counties in California to try to see, what explained the variations in common interest housing. And it really comes down to two things. And this is very consistent with what developers say if you talk to them and local governments say. It's the supply side that's driving it. It's not the demand side. I mean, you read in the newspapers, they say, oh, people want to live in gated communities. Yeah, no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that it's the supply side that's driving it. Developers want to increase residential density. They want to get more people on less land. That's where the profit comes from for a developer. Once they have purchased the land, all the profit will be determined by how many units they can get on it. And if you carve it up into a whole lot of big lots like Ozzie and Harriet type subdivisions in the 1950s or something like that, put a swimming pool in every lot, you're not going to get very many lots. But if you can compress the lots, make them smaller, give everyone one pool to share in common ownership, one park, no big lawns, small lawns, but one open space and one pool, common utility lines instead of separate ones, and on and on. There are many, many savings. And the developers can get more people on less land for a lot less money. And they make a fortune. So developers find common interest housing extremely profitable. I mean, the ultimate, of course, is a condo. I mean, instead, how many houses can you put on the one block that a condominium sits on? Okay, now the condo goes up 30 stories. How many units do you have now? So, and the other key development is local government fiscal capacity. And this is a key, for urban politics students, this is a really important issue. Local governments are silent partners in all of this. They are facilitating it, and they know they are facilitating it, and they know why they are facilitating it. The answer is they want tax windfalls because developers and the association cover the cost of building and operating private infrastructure, which means the city doesn't have to build it and doesn't have to maintain it. So the private water systems, private streets and roads, private sewer systems, private water detention ponds, and on and on and on. They lay the utility lines, they do all the work. The private developer does it. And it all gets absorbed into the price of the housing, and then the private taxation, the assessments that are imposed on the owners by their private associations to maintain it forever. So the local governments get a full property tax payment from all of these people for new homes. They get the same money they'd get if they were providing services, but they don't have to provide them. And so, once I was doing went to some American Bar Association conference, and they took us on a tour of Hilton Head. South Carolina is this beautiful luxury island. It's nothing but gated communities, just wall to wall gated communities. So someone asked the city manager, who was guiding us on the tour. They said, hey, how come it's all private communities? And he looked at this lawyer like, like, are you kidding me? Don't you know? And he said, because they're cash cows. See, and that's really what it comes down to. They're cash cows. They generate a lot of revenues, tax revenues, and very little cost. So I found in my study that 2/3 of the variation in the number of percentage of these private communities is explained just by two variables: land economics, land prices, the cost of land, and local government indebtedness. So now this is I say always, this is really epitomizes the neoliberal era. And I know many people don't like that term. I don't know how you folks feel about it, but I think it's a useful term. I know it has vague meanings, but it definitely epitomizes the notion of privatization. I mean, neoliberalism has carried with it this ideology of privatism, that the private sector is always better. The public sector, meaning government, is wasteful and inefficient, and private ownership brings market logic and market incentives and makes everything better, right? And out of that comes privatization of local government functions, and out of that comes the rise of common interest governments. And I have some problems with the way the way this rhetoric works. So this is to me is an ideological statement. That privatism is an ideology, and these statements are ideologically driven. They are not empirically driven. Now, but there are some really good books about privatization, and I'd like to look at a bit about what at least one of them has to say, and just look at this institution and ask the question, like, does it make sense to do this the way we've done it? John Donahue's book, The Privatization Decision, came out, in the early 90s, I guess. It's quite a good book on this, and he asks really fundamental questions. So we look at what HOAs and condos are doing, and look at the way it's spreading, and then we just ask, does this make sense? So first, he says, you should ask, you need to ask the question, does the public have a strong interest in having a certain thing done, and having it done to certain standards? And now, if they don't, then maybe the government shouldn't be doing it. I mean, if the public has no interest in doing it, or doesn't care how it gets done, then maybe they shouldn't be doing it at all, and just, let it go. But if we have an interest in having something done, like I'll use the example of garbage collection. We have an interest in having the garbage collected, right? And we have an interest in seeing that it's done properly, not just delegated to someone who doesn't do it right. So if that is the case, if it is a public task and if we want it done well, then Donahue says we need to ask two questions. One, how should we pay for it? And basically, who should do it? Should it be done by private employees or public employees? Who should do it? So this leads us to basically thinking about 4 different ways to carry out tasks. Based upon a simple 2x2 table. How should we pay for it, and how should it be delivered? So on the payment front, we have collective payment in the form of taxation. We have individual payment in the form of fees and prices. And on the left column, we have who should do it. Public sector, meaning government departments and public employees. Government employees need to do it. And private sector delivery, where we're fine with having non-governmental organizations and employees do it. Understand, we've already got to the point where saying this is an important thing that we want to have done properly, right? Now, this gives us 4 different options. 1, government services collectively paid for through taxation and done by government employees. Public, that's the typical government services that everyone, is so in the neoliberal era is so disdainful of. And then the bottom right, we have the opposite. Individual payment through fees and prices delivered by private sector employees, profit-making corporations. What's there? Market provision of goods, which can also involve, in privatization schemes, vouchers, voluntarism, and just load shedding, the government getting rid of jobs entirely, just letting people do it. That's the private consumer economy, where all the government does is enforce contracts. But the really interesting privatization arguments are in the top right and the bottom left. So in the top right, we have the situation where we have government vending. Individual payment for services and products provided for by the public, such as the Postal Service, such as national parks, such as census products that we pay for. But all these things are done ultimately by government employees, and we pay for them as we want to individually. Now we get down to the bottom left, and this is where most privatization schemes work, where we have tasks involving collective payment, in other words, tax dollars, and private sector delivery, contracting, franchises, grants, national defense procurement. That's how we do it, private companies, and often garbage collection. I'm going to use this example of garbage collection because I think it's a really useful one to think about. Let's think about this for a sec, okay? Let's say the city of Chicago or Elmwood Park or Evanston, someplace, they want to privatize their garbage collection. Right now, it's being done by a department of the local government, and it has government employees driving the garbage trucks. Now, do we want to have this task done properly? Absolutely, it's a very important task. But then we ask the question, how do you want to pay for it? And do we need to have government employees drive the garbage trucks? Well, now you start to see there's different ways to do this. There's different ways to make this happen. You can have a private company, give them a franchise, exclusive franchise, and then everyone pays the private company, Groot or somebody like that, but it's done by a private company and paid for privately, but it's a franchise regulated by the government. The city sets up competitive bidding, evaluates the proposals, contracts specific tasks to be performed. They have the standards. They can see if it's being done right. They can renew the contract or they can terminate it if they don't like the way it's done. That's called accountability. Now, let's think about how we do this with HOAs. State and local governments issue subdivision and building permits. Developers build all this infrastructure, set everything up, set up the private association, and then what? They walk away. That's the last you see of the developer. As soon as they sell their units, they're gone. Bye-bye. You'll never see them again. They've made their money and they're gone. No more responsibility. And I think that's rather odd. I mean, from an accountability standpoint, the developer sells the units and then they just leave. Now who's in charge? A group, the homeowner association, which is who? Whoever the owners voted for to run the place. There is no training. There's no qualifications except for owning a unit. There's no oversight of what they do. And if you're a condo board or HOA board does something crazy, where do you turn? And the answer is hire a lawyer, sue them. Pull $30,000 out of your pocket and go sue them. Good luck, because there's nobody to turn to. We have no specifications of how the tasks are to be done. They're supposed to educate themselves on how to do it. They're supposed to be lawyers or something. And the assumption is that this arrangement will continue forever. That's the plan. It'll just go forever. Now imagine, just to carry my analogy out a little bit here, imagine that we privatized trash collection the way we did with HOAs. How would we do it? We would say, the market, the free market governs everything. And everyone that owns these houses in Elmhurst or Elmwood Park or Oak Park or wherever, Chicago, they have an interest in their property values. And they know, because they're rational actors, that clean streets and sanitation are essential to property values. So I'm sure they'll take care of it. So we're out of that business. The city, we're not going to collect the trash. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to supervise it. We're not going to make any specifications. We're just going to count on the free market seeing to it that it gets done. I'm sure the trash will be collected because the invisible hand of the marketplace will see to it that it gets done. Does anybody think that this would work? Is there anyone who believes that that would be that the market works that way? That human beings operate like that? No, of course not. Nobody would. Places would be nightmares. You'd have some places, I suppose, where people would get their act together and see it and get it done. And there'd be a lot of other places that would be a public health catastrophe. But this is exactly what we did with HOAs. What I just described. This is how we did this gigantic privatization where 22 million Americans live. 22% of the public lives. 9 trillion in property values is under this scheme. That's how we do it. And that's, to me, the neoliberal era in a nutshell. It's just really a truly bizarre. It is the largest, the most enormous load shedding. That's what a system of privatization where the government just stops doing something, that's called load shedding. And that's what we did with HOAs. The local government just said, let these people move in, give them a home, and we'll just stop worrying about them. I mean, almost entirely, we just stopped worrying about their issues. So you have a giant, unplanned, unregulated unloading of government responsibilities onto a bunch of untrained, unpaid, unsupported amateurs. And the governments that they're operating are corporations. They are not democracies. They're not intended to be democracies. There's no local democracy involved. It's not supposed to be. I'm not saying that as a criticism. It's just that's the way they're set up. They're corporations. They're top down. That's how corporations operate. Corporations are not democratic and were never intended to be democratic. And so you get a lot of litigation. I mean, most associations work fine. If you folks some of you live in a condo, I'm sure it'll be fine for a while until you elect a crazy person as the president. But, most of the time they work okay. But in the big picture, in the long term, they have a lot of problems. The institution has a lot of problems, and there's a lot of failed associations that I want to talk with you about. So what I'm saying is to recap, common interest housing has this very, very distinct, identifiable institutional history, and it comes right through the neoliberal era. Yes, they've been around for a long time, but they exploded in the late 70s. It is a massive privatization of local government functions where we do not have provisions for accountability at any level. It's very spotty and very inconsistent. There's a lot about the way these governments run that we would have to call illiberal. You're not protected by the Bill of Rights. They're not state actors. So you don't have constitutional rights with respect to decisions made by your HOA. If we get to the poorest case, if we have time, I'll show you what that looks like. You don't have separation of powers, civil liberties, whatever visibility or transparency you have is just governed by state statutes, and it's pretty minimal and very hard to enforce those rights, very hard. So even though they are really part of the intergovernmental system, they're not well integrated or articulated into that system in sort of systematic ways. There's a few places around the country where they are. In Arizona, most notably, they've set up Mesa, Phoenix, they've set up some councils to try to get representation from the big condo and HOA boards into local government. So there's coordination of activities, which is a really good idea, but it only exists in a very few places. And it's really driven by the fiscal considerations of local government and the land use economics of large-scale real estate developers. But it has a lot of potential impacts on our culture. We can talk about that if you want, but now my view is, we call them private governments. I use the term private, but truthfully, they aren't really fully private, and they certainly aren't fully public. This whole question of what we mean by public and private, we could talk about that too. That's a very interesting concept. But where is all this going? If you've looked at Beyond Privatopia, I don't think they're replacing municipalities, and I think there is something of an institutional convergence that has been going on. Whether that will continue, I don't know, because our recent research suggests that a lot of these arrangements are being unwound because they aren't working. And I think there are real concerns about sustainability, the sustainability of associations in the long term. I mean, we're talking about several 100,000 associations that have only been around for 40 years. And all that infrastructure, all those buildings, the roofs, the foundations, all of it is wearing out. Will the money be there? Is the money there to keep it all going? And that is one of the questions I want to explore with you. There were a lot of problems, when the housing market crashed in 2008, a lot of problems appeared. And I'll talk with you about some of those in a minute when I get to some of the specifics. But the problems have really increased. And part of the issue here is that let me just draw a comparison with local governments, because sometimes I've talked, with a lot of people or debated people who are libertarians on this issue. And they love HOAs. Libertarians think that HOAs are wonderful. I have a good friend of mine, Professor Robert Nelson at the University of Maryland. He's an economist. He's a libertarian. He's a wonderful guy. And we've debated this numerous times about this whole issue. He thinks that in the long term, associations are going to replace cities. If you've ever read any of you read Robert Nozick's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia? Really, really good book that articulates the libertarian vision of utopia, which basically says, private protective associations will eventually replace local governments. And in the view of Bob Nelson and other libertarians, that's what's happening with HOAs. They think they're going to replace cities. I don't think that, but we will see. I think we'd be lucky if many of these associations even survive another 10, 20 years. But it's an interesting intellectual exercise to ask yourself, where is this going to go? What does it imply about the nature of public governments? But in comparing them, let me just ask you to think about it this way. Let's take a municipality and let's take the HOAs, set them side by side, and ask yourself, how are they supported? Now, I know we have some public administration students in this class. Well, cities have an entire academic discipline and a profession dedicated to supporting them. There are MPA programs all over the country, turning out highly qualified, highly trained people who know about budgeting and personnel management and all sorts of other systems. And they're ready to step into these jobs. That whole profession is there to support local government and have sound, high quality local government. That was the reason for the profession coming into existence. Do we have that for HOAs? No. What we have is property managers, who are the private analog of this. And there's only 8 states where they even have to have licenses. And so fortunately, Illinois is one of them, but in 42 states, you don't even need a license to be a property manager. There's no educational requirements. There's nothing. You need a business card. You can't sell a hot dog in any state without a license, but you can manage millions of dollars in people's assessments and give them advice on the law and everything else, which you know nothing about, just by having a business card and some stationery that's in a website that says you're a property manager. So there's one comparison. Now here's another one. What about when you get into financial difficulties? Many cities and counties have gotten into financial difficulties for various reasons. Detroit, Orange County, California, Jefferson County, Alabama, big municipal bankruptcies. Chapter 9, there it is right there. Right there in the bankruptcy code, Chapter 9. You go right into Chapter 9 proceedings and reorganize. You don't liquidate like with a Chapter 7. You just, you renegotiate labor contracts or do away with them. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but in terms of the effects, but it's a support for an important institution, municipal governments. They have their own section of the bankruptcy code. So there's provision there for them to stay alive and to survive at the expense of their creditors. What about HOAs, condo associations? If there's time, I will talk with you more about how that works, but just take it from me, it doesn't work. Going bankrupt for condo and HOAs when they have horrible debts that they can't pay, it doesn't work. It places them in great jeopardy because it places their assets in the hands of a bankruptcy referee or judge. And the key asset that is placed in the hands of others is their ability to assess the owners to make them pay the debts of the association. And that is a very, very bad situation. The association then basically makes their owners vulnerable to whatever the bankruptcy trustee wants to make them pay. And that has produced some really horrifying results. So they don't even have that. So, and I could go on. I've got one of these presentations, I've got a whole table. I could go on about this, but we have, here's another one, bailouts. Local governments get bailouts from higher levels of government, help of various sorts. not always economic, but I mean, the Chicago gets in trouble, the legislature might step in and do something that might help them. The national government grants in aid. The federal government, the state governments have all sorts of support mechanisms. And I mean, it's not perfect, but what is there for HOAs and condo associations? The answer is nothing. Nothing. There's no one to bail them out. They have entirely private resources. They can try to get loans. Well, anyone can try to get a loan, but those all come with conditions. So, condo and HOA residents and their private governments are not supported the way municipal governments are. And my argument has been for many years, if you want this to continue, if you don't want to have a lot more failures like what happened in Florida, you got to support the institution. You can't just leave it out there. This utopian dream that it's all just going to survive forever because of the magic of the market. This is nonsense. This is just a pipe dream. They really do need to be supported, the people running these associations. So I'll go through some of the challenges now and get into some of the specifics. By the way, does anyone have any questions or comments? I see there might be something up here in the chat. Let me check. True Valley used to be a co-op until they're no longer a co-op. Well, I'll have to take them off my list. Sorry about that. I thought they still were. Any questions or comments, reactions?
Yeah, I mean, so this is Mitch. I actually am the treasurer of our HOA condo association, 21 unit condo association. And I mean, I entirely agree with you on a lot of pieces. I do think that there are a lot of challenges that our condo or association does not face that larger, units like, actual subdivisions like you're describing in some of these do face. And I think there are a lot of efficiencies that happen at the small scale like this that otherwise don't. But I mean, I think you raise a lot of very important points about the condo associations. And I think we've all heard probably horror stories about management and rulemaking and everything else that turns into lawsuits and rights being violated and whatnot. But just a quick comment on that. And I think that, I guess a question actually would be, is there a place for these associations? I mean, I would assume, I would think that the condo buildings that I live in, that, that's the only way that it's actually viable to live like this. So
exactly. Yeah. Yes, I do think that. And if we get to the end of this, I got a whole section where I talk about this. A lot of the condo associations in Chicago are just going away. It's called deconversion, and you may have heard of it. A lot of them have expenses that they can't meet. They're getting bought out by investors, and a lot of the low cost owner-occupied housing in condos in Chicago is just being turned back into apartments because it's not viable financially. And I think that's really unfortunate because young people, graduate students, assistant professors, young people coming out of high school and college with jobs, they want to be able to get into the housing market. And there's nothing wrong with, having lower priced, affordable condos. What else can you have? I mean, because of the cost of land, there has to be high density of owner occupied housing. There has to be. So either we're going to have to facilitate housing cooperatives, which is one thing we could do, or we have to prop up condo housing. We have to give it the institutional support. I think it definitely has a place. And my concern is that it's not being supported sufficiently so that we can, keep it going. Yes, Scott?
Yeah, I had a childhood classmate that got stung in a condo situation, much like you're describing. She'd bought into a smaller condo conversion. It was maybe like 5 or 7 unit building. And I think there were some code issues. And long story short, the developer up and left and, kind of stuck them with the whole thing, including a couple of unsold units within the building. I don't know how it ultimately worked out for him, but they did get burned.
Yeah, I've got a few slides on some that doesn't sound like a fraud situation, maybe just, bad decisions, but there have actually been major frauds conducted in this city. I mean, a lot of them. And I've got some numbers for you on that, where owners really got into a bad situation and through no fault of their own because of fraudulent sales and fraudulent conversions that weren't really done properly. So there's a lot to be careful of, you know.
But
Well, I was
in
just gonna,
addition to the challenges that you have on this page, which I recognize are very important, can you speak a little bit about in their role as private governments, how they're able to prevent political campaigning, how they can require that the house be painted white and not pink, that they
Yeah.
can, you can't even put out an American flag in some cases, just a few of the horror stories to give a sense of what happens when this private government makes what would in the public realm be an unsupportable decision.
yeah, well, that's a really good point. Yes. Well, I usually use the term illiberal to describe this type of government. It's illiberal in the sense that they're not liberal democracies. They don't guarantee a realm of privacy. They don't have protect First Amendment rights. Because they're private corporations, they don't have to. It's just a different type of organization. And you don't have constitutional rights. You don't have freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of press or freedom of assembly or freedom from unreasonable entry. You don't have any of that. What you have is whatever the governing documents say you have. So you have a declaration, you have rules and regulations, you have these private rules, and that's your constitution. But it's not like any constitution we're accustomed to. It is not citizenship as we understand it. It is membership in a private association. So I've got these slides about the Porus decision, which is PORIS, which is an Illinois case. I'll get to that in a bit. But you know, these associations can, if you're in a community that has streets, they can pull you over a car with flashing lights and someone dressed like a cop with nightsticks and badges and all this stuff can pull you over, take your license and give you a ticket. And there's no Fourth Amendment involved. There's no Fifth Amendment. There's none of that. The Illinois Supreme Court says, no, hey, you know, you joined a club. It's like you joined a voluntary organization. And, you know, you got to follow the rules of your organization. If the rules say that they can pull you over and give you a ticket, then see, they've privatized every aspect of local government. But when they do that, they remove all the constitutional liberties. As far as democracy goes, well, I mean, the way municipal elections work, with the exception of special districts, and I just wrote this book chapter on that, special districts are really an interesting exception, but local governments are operated according to the one person, one vote rule. People vote, right? Well, not in a condo association or an HOA. Yeah, property interest vote. And your vote is weighted according to the value of your property. And it's one vote per unit. There may be 10 people living in that unit. There's one vote for that unit. And it's based on a percentage of the interest in the association. So this is a completely different concept. The idea of citizenship is really replaced with property ownership and the rights of property ownership versus the rights of citizenship. Elections, you know, in general, I could go into more of the details because again, I have some slides on this, but these elections, unfortunately, many condo associations are not clean elections. I don't want to go down the Trump train avenue here, but you know, the big steal or anything, but a lot of these elections are not monitored very closely. There are many complaints and there have been actually associations taken over by con artists. And then, you know, as Dick was saying, the rules. Your local government, I mean, local governments have rules about building codes and this sort of thing. They certainly do. But there's some things they can't do. So for example, there's a Supreme Court decision. It's a city, I think the city was called Ladue, Ladue, which is down in the St. Louis area. And they passed a law that said you couldn't have any signs on your lawn, and they included political signs. This went all the way to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, can't do that. Political signs are a valued form of expression going back to before the founding of before the Constitution, and local governments cannot ban them, violates the First Amendment. Well, Okay, associations ban political signs every day of the week, 365 days a year, goes on all across the country. They do it all the time. And they make it stick. And you have no US constitutional right. You can't say, wait a minute, what about the Ledoux case? Yeah, too bad. It's not a government, according to the Supreme Court, according to the courts in general. It is not a government. And therefore, they are not, there's no state action and constitutional liberties don't apply. Now, there have been many, many, many disputes about flags, flag display. Americans are, real big on flags. They love flags. Associations can ban flags anytime they want to. Now, the only reason they can't and don't is because there have been laws passed to carve out little exceptions for flags so that you can display, a flag. But what about a flagpole? You put on your lawn, you put a flagpole, put the flag on a flagpole. Now you've got a problem because now you've built a structure and they'll say you have to take it down and they'll make that stick every time. So there are many, many other ways in which there have been decisions in the state of New Jersey, some really interesting ones, where people have tried to use expansive provisions of state constitutions. As in New Jersey and California, they have expansive civil liberties provisions under their state constitutions to try to restrict homeowner association activities so that they, when sometimes the voting precinct is in the condo lobby, for example, and to try to regulate that. This gets complicated, but all of this has to be taken to court. And you have to try to win, your basic rights as an American in front of a local judge because you don't have them. And things like color of your curtains and whether you can park a pickup truck in your garage, in your driveway or not. It's your driveway. Can you park it there? Not if they tell you you can't. Can you have a satellite dish? It's up to them, So these things, let's see, I see there's a chat. Let me just check the chat. Ledoux versus Galeo. Thank you, Daniel. You're absolutely right. That is the decision. Well done. See, it's wonderful having graduate students around here.
And you had a question, Daniel?
Yes, I used to work in elections, so I threatened people with that more than once. So I know that the Texas Department of Housing was sued over, or successfully sued the Inclusive Communities Project, I think it was, in Bern, Texas, over prohibiting a mezuzah on a condominium door. So the First Amendment religious protections have been applied to the actions of condominium association.
I'm not aware of any place where that was done by application of the First Amendment. There are statutes. Like in the state of Illinois. Here in Illinois, we have a section of the Condo Act that gives you the right to display a small religious symbol, and that's what it's supposed to be. It came out of that case, but this is a matter for state laws because there's no U.S. constitutional right. These are private business corporations. Now there are a couple of ways that courts could, if they wanted, could do this though. The two leading ones, or there's three. The first would be Marsh versus Alabama. This is a case, this is from the 1940s, 1946, I believe it was, where a Jehovah's Witness was passing out religious literature in Chickasaw, Alabama, which is a company town owned by the Gulf Shipbuilding Corporation. She was arrested, charged with trespassing because she's trespassing. They said, get off, you can't, distribute your handbills here. She said First Amendment. They said trespassing. She was charged with trespassing. And the Supreme Court in this amazing decision said, if a municipality, if a private corporation behaves so much like a municipality that it's indistinguishable, then it's going to be held to constitutional standards. And that is called the public function test for state action. And it has gone no place ever since. The Supreme Court has had opportunities to do this. I was an expert witness in a case where the ACLU hired me and we to do this. We attempted to get this through even in the state of New Jersey, and the New Jersey Supreme Court wouldn't have it. The second one is Shelley versus Kramer. That is the decision about racial restrictive covenants, where, again, the Supreme Court said, this is called the judicial enforcement theory. Judicial enforcement of a private discriminatory racial covenant is state action, that the enforcement in the courts of a private act is state action. By the way, this is an interesting precedent in light of that Texas abortion statute that is to be enforced through private litigation. This is an interesting one, but that's another story. And the third is this case involving a parking garage in Delaware that was engaging in racial discrimination. This is a long story, but this is the the entanglement theory, that sometimes the government can be so entangled with the actions of a private organization that it becomes state action. You could
But
use
all
any-
of those examples involve suspect classes.
Yes,
So
exactly. Yes.
that those precedents might not apply to,
Yeah.
can you put up a flag or paint your house pink?
I think that's right. That's absolutely true. They all involve suspect classifications. You could also make the argument, though, that fundamental liberties, that really fundamental liberties, are the equivalent of suspect classifications under the Equal Protection Clause. You can make that argument. But I agree with you. I mean, in the case of Marsh versus Alabama, it wasn't a racial discrimination issue at all. It was basically the First Amendment. So, it's fundamental rights, fundamental constitutional liberty, foundational political expression, this or religious expression, this sort of thing. So these are arguments that have been made in the courts around the country. And as yet, we have not been able to get courts to buy it. So,
Evan, why don't we take a 10-minute break here and give everybody a chance to move around. This is fascinating, and I know that the discussion we're going to have about the other problems of condominiums is going to be even more so. This whole topic of private governments and whether or not they can be held accountable, whether or not they undermine democracy and local government, is one of fundamental importance. But let's take a break until 5:10, and then we will reconvene at that point.
great. See you then. Back live.
Yes. And Evan, we can cut off with your presentation at any point, you know, if you need to leave after 6 or something. We technically go to 6:30.
Okay, how late do you usually go, or does it vary?
About 6:15 usually.
Okay,
And then
that
I
sounds
take
good.
individual students' questions and problems and papers they're working on, and so on.
Okay. I'll figure on stopping in about an hour or so then, or
Okay,
thereabouts. Once we start.
yeah.